Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Suicide Grief 101. My name is Casey Maitland, and I am the Chief Clinical Officer for Samaritans, a suicide prevention organization in Massachusetts that's been around for nearly 50 years. We run a 24/7 helpline that is part of the National 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, a text line called Hey Sam, where young people can get mental health support, educational outreach programs, and grief support services for those who've lost a loved one to suicide. Before we get started with our program today, I'd like to go over a few ground rules. This program is being recorded, and we will share the recording within the next week. Throughout the program, please send any questions that you have using the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. We will answer as many audience questions as possible at the end of the program. Our webinar today is called Suicide Grief 101, and today we'll have a conversation about defining grief, understanding suicide, and reflections on grief from suicide loss. We will also review strategies to support yourself, others, and your community after a suicide loss. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the Parmenter Foundation for funding this program. We had more than 355 participants today, and we really can't thank you all enough for being here. It shows how important this topic is and how much need there is for this conversation. So thank you very much to the Parmenter Foundation for making this webinar possible. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Stephen Kariskis. Stephen is an educator, an emotion scientist, a leader in the development of whole child emotional well-being, an advocate for educator well-being, an activist for suicide prevention and suicide grief awareness, and a dynamic and creative community builder. A loss to suicide survivor himself, Stephen earned his PhD in psychology and was most recently our very own Senior Director of Community Education and Outreach with Samaritans. Thank you very much for being here today, Stephen.
Thank you, Casey. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. I know how hard it might be to be here to talk about this topic and to reflect on this topic, and also how important it is to be here to really think about how to support yourself and how to support others. I want to dive right into the information. There's going to be an opportunity to, I hope, for some Q&A at the end. And also, if you put a question or two in as you were registering, I spent some time reflecting on answering that during their webinar time together. So also, it was really kind of fun to see all the places you're from and to learn a little bit more about why you're here in the poll that we did. We're gonna have a couple more polls later on to engage in different ways. Okay, I just want to make sure everything is clicking, and here we go. So what to expect today? We're going to be talking about grief. Obviously, this is right there in the title. We will talk about suicide. We'll talk about the complexity of it, the challenges that tie to grieving. And we are really going to focus primarily, we're going to focus on how to support others, how to support a community, how to support yourself. And we're going to come at that a couple different ways throughout our time together. And I want to be really open here at the beginning to remember to take care of yourself. So things to remember, that suicide can be a very heavy topic. We all bring our own story to our time together today. And that story may be influenced by an impact of your own struggle or a loss to someone. So take care of yourself as needed. That can look like a lot of things. I have tea right next to me. That could be, putting your head down. It could be standing up and stretching, lots of different things. So think about what your needs might be over the next 45 minutes. And stretching and taking deep breaths are probably really good options, right? Ask questions. We do have the Q&A feature open. So if there's some questions that we can answer really quickly, we will do that as they're happening. And other times, maybe there's questions we can get to at the end. And do reach out if you need any help. Again, the chat feature is open, and also we'll be talking a lot about resources later. So hopefully we'll give you some resources that are going to be really supportive and helpful for you. So I want to talk just for a moment about Samaritans, and through this grant, doing this work with Samaritans and who Samaritans is. Samaritans is a nonprofit, Boston-based nonprofit that works in suicide prevention and suicide bereavement. Some of the work and programming they have is a 24/7 helpline. They have a tool and a resource called Hey Sam, which is a peer-to-peer text line for young people. I will talking about that later on too. They have the community education and outreach department, which is one I led for a while, which is we're going into schools, doing work with young people, going into colleges and universities, and doing that community outreach. There's also the Grief Support Services, which again, I'll be talking about a little later as a support maybe for you also. So let's talk about grief. Many of you, as I was seeing the who's joining, some of you already are in this field. Some of you have a lot of knowledge based on your own loss. But I just want to reflect on grief and make sure that we're kind of on the same page around defining it, right? So this is a definition and a description by Dr. Dakota King White that I feel is really lovely and comprehensive. And it talks about how grief is an overwhelming emotional response to a loss. And that loss can look like a lot of different things. Today, we're talking about a loss of suicide, but things like moving or losing a job, that can bring up grief also. There's no specific time frame to grief. In our society, we sometimes say, you get a couple days bereavement or 2 weeks, and then we're supposed to move on. But there's no specific time frame to it. And then there are a lot of emotions that can rise up. It can be thought of as a loss of regulation. When we think of our emotions as information, that we are responding to something in our emotions on a daily basis. Well, when we're responding, our emotions are responding to grief, it can be a loss of regulation, of our emotional regulation. So our emotions can be a lot bigger, and sometimes on the other end, a lot smaller, like feeling numb. So they can be quite big: sadness, anger, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, or emotional numbness. In addition, it's a normal reaction, and we don't always kind of accept that. Even when I just stated that, many people will still judge it. They'll still judge that they're still working on grief a month later, a year later, 10 years later. It's a normal response, and it can impact you emotionally, of course, psychologically, and even physically. It can look like, of course, crying, sadness, depression, avoiding things, shutting down, changes in your sleep patterns. A lot of people will say they can't sleep or they oversleep. And then things like exhaustion, fogginess, forgetfulness, body aches, stomach aches. And when we sometimes, in some of my work, I support young people, and they are so much in their emotion about the grief that they can't get to their learning, their cognitive faculties are not working in the same way, and that gets into that forgetfulness and fogginess. I apologize. Hold on real quick. For some reason, my slides just jumped to later slides. I apologize. I'm not sure why that happened, but I will fix it. I apologize. Here we go. Where's that right there? That was an odd dynamic to jump all the way to the end there. Okay, and so I want to just pause real quick around grief, because if you haven't kind of had a lot of experience with grief or a lot of understanding of it, or you're even new to the grieving process based on just losses in your life, sometimes we go right to what sometimes are called the stage of the grief by the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I want to just be very clear about this, is that the work is really important. And these stages, and I'm using quotes here, we're never meant to be linear. Like, you don't do this step, then this step, then this step. So understand that you may go through, or the person you're supporting may go through some of these grief processes. And at the same time, or these stages, they may not. And as Casey shared, as a survivor of loss to suicide, I've never found anger. And that's not everyone. It's just something that I haven't found. And then in more recent years, David Kessler, who is a protege and worked deeply with Dr. Kubler-Ross, actually has created what he calls another stage, which is the finding meaning. And this is a stage that some of us get to too, where we want to find meaning or purpose, but not everyone gets there either. So it's not something you have to do anything. It can also look like this. And there's a really intentionality to the colors and the brightness and the intensity of this slide, right? It's overwhelming. So it is overwhelming. And it also, if you glance at a couple of these, and there's a lot on this slide, I know, and there's again attention to that, it can also be grief for some people is very lonely. And we'll talk about grief to suicide specifically. It's tough. It's not always manageable. It also can be like, I'm going to have a piece of chocolate and then like, oh my gosh, that reminded me of my person because they love caramel chocolate, right? Or a song comes on. It's a journey, right? It can impact us when we least expect it, and it becomes a part of you. It's really hard to define, and it can be really challenging. And it's a different path for everyone. And this is hard also because sometimes when we're trying to support someone, your grief journey might have looked like one path and they're on a completely different path. And this can happen in families also, where the adults or a parent is grieving differently than the children, and it could be really challenging. But accepting that that there are different paths, and part of this are accepting the reality of the loss that can take time, different time periods, allowing the pain to kind of come through, adjusting to reality without the person, maybe depending on your relationship, moving on to other relationships that could look different for everyone. And for many, and it is a lifelong journey. Sometimes in the grief groups, the peer support grief groups I lead, some people will join the groups and it's 17 years after their loss. They just know they need to connect with others who had a loss to suicide and know that it's still a part of their life journey. So I want to talk specifically about grief to a suicide loss. We'll get into here. I want to just explain some terminology so that we're all on the same page, especially for those that this may be new for them. If you're here because you want to care for someone who's at a loss, but you are kind of new to this information. So of course, suicide is a death caused by self-directed injurious behavior. And a suicide attempt is non-fatal and self-directed. Suicidal ideation is thinking about, considering, or planning. And suicidal ideation may not lead to an attempt. So just know that some people think about it, and we also want to be outreaching and supporting them, but know that it doesn't always lead to an attempt, but we want to be aware of that. Suicide prevention are the activities like Samaritans does, the work we do around reducing suicide risk factors. Suicide postvention is the work that is being done to support people who've had a loss to suicide. And the last one, just some language that can be confusing at times. If you've had a loss to suicide, some of the language is survivor of suicide or survivor of suicide loss. We want to make sure we're not confusing that with survivor of a suicide attempt, right? Those are completely, obviously different things. And they could, you may have had both of those experiences in your life, but they are different. And so most people who had a loss of suicide will say they're a survivor of a suicide loss, or they are a suicide survivor. So grief from suicide can look quite a bit different from other types of losses. This is why we want to talk about it very distinctly and why we do a webinar like this. It can be some of the most painful experiences, and I'll dive into why that is in a few minutes. But there's some feelings that end up actually being very much magnified in this type of loss: guilt, confusion, rejection, thinking if you're in a relationship, a spousal relationship, and your spouse dies by suicide, that could bring up rejection pieces, shame, stigma, right? All of this rises up based on some societal pieces. And also anger can be really magnified, and that anger can be really confusing because sometimes we have anger at the individual who died. So it also can elevate certain pieces, because the research will show that grieving children and adults can be a higher risk for things like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even suicidal behaviors. We'll talk about later why this is so important to recognize and why it's so important to get some support, some clinical therapeutic support, as well as potentially peer support. Some people may experience a prolonged form of grief called complicated grief, or sometimes it's called persistent complex bereavement disorder. And this just means you're stuck. You're really stuck in it. It's debilitating, and you really need some extra support, which again would be maybe more clinical and therapeutic in nature. So why is this so different? There are so many layers to this, and I want to go through these. So why is this so different? So the circumstances of the loss, the means, and means mean what the word means is how they took their life, how they ended their life. So that means can be very upsetting, right? It can, it's something that we'll talk about a little bit later also. The connection to the loss, the discovery of the individual, it's unexpected, and sometimes it's violent in nature, which can be quite a bit different from other types of losses. It has unique emotional and physical reactions, such as post-traumatic stress can rise up. The questions are immense. And one of the challenges with the loss of suicide is that many of the questions that we have as individuals who had a loss will not be answerable. They don't have answers to. And that is a piece that you have to grow to come to accept. There's shame, there's guilt, there could be stigma, there can be blame, and there can be a feeling of isolation. This isolation rises up for many people who have had a loss of suicide, which is why we talk a lot about connecting and the things you can do to support them. Potential family tension. So maybe there was tension before the person died because of some of their struggles, but after also things like blame can really tear a family apart, or not understanding what happened. So that can rise up. A lack of privacy that can be tied to things like investigations. So sometimes the police are involved, and all these layers don't happen in other losses. Practical concerns such as finances and funerals and the healing process and bereavement time, that's never enough, right? So all of these kind of combine to make this a really different type of loss. I'll mention that when I work with young people, and I do peer support group work with teens and 20-somethings, and many times 20-somethings might be in a space where they are managing an estate, and they were in college and they had this loss, and all of a sudden they're managing an estate or insurance and things they never thought they'd have to. So these all end up being kind of very different situations with this type of a loss. So how to support? We're going to come at this again, I said, in a couple different directions to make sure we're thinking about community, thinking about taking care of yourself, and taking care of others. So one of the things that when people are have a loss of suicide or the grief process is what we call the dual process of grief. So this is the work that is typically happening where we're balancing the idea that we are grieving and we're focusing on all the feelings, and we need to do that. We need to share memories, think about our person, even say, gosh, I wish they were here, and have some magical thinking and work through all of those feelings. And we need to do a restoration process. That's a process of moving forward, not moving on, but moving forward. Those are different words: rebuilding, restoring life. This may include learning to fill spaces, learning new rituals and routines. Holidays may look different, right? So we're thinking about the holidays coming up and how that may look different. So the dual process, it's kind of happening at the same time. And sometimes you need to be off balance and doing the deep grieving, and other times really restoring. But if you're doing both of these at the same time, it's a healthy way to go. So the idea here is that sorrow and joy can sit together, right? So we can have both. We can be very sad that we have this loss, and we can also have gratitude for the life that was lived. And some of this idea here is from the work of Dr. Susan David and her work on emotional agility, the understanding how to move between your emotions, and emotion granularity, which is digging into your emotions into a granular level. So understanding that sorrow and joy can sit together, and how do you do that for yourself, and how do you help others? We'll be talking about that in just a minute. So the next couple slides I want to share are research-based, and at the same time, the language was developed by someone who has lived experience, and it wasn't me. A young person that I was supporting in one of the peer support groups actually shared out loud actually probably a year ago, that she struggled with her friends not supporting her in the way that she felt she needed. So she made a decision to make a document, a one-pager. And I thought, how powerful, how unique, right? And she wrote this up. And it became such a useful tool for the people in my group and for this young person that she actually presented it at a conference, an Active Mind conference in Washington, D.C., to share with others. So I want to use some of her language, lived experience language, how you can support someone who had a loss to suicide. So the first two things here, she talks about stay connected. And this means offering support continuously. And it doesn't mean daily, right? It could mean daily at certain times, but it means that this is going to be a journey and that the support may need to happen on a continuous basis. It may lessen, but it's not going to be something that's going to go away or be fixed. Acknowledge emotional dates and reach out. Offer support specifically. So the idea here is that really, if you're supporting someone, reflect on what are their emotional dates, anniversaries and birthdays, holidays, the day of the loss. All of those things may be days that you may want to specifically reach out and offer support. Show an openness to talk about the person that was lost to suicide. Talk about their life, not about their death. This was actually a question in the registration process where someone said, is it okay to talk about them? And it is. Sometimes it may be a question, I want to share a story of David, or I'd like to share this story. Is that okay? But it is okay to talk about it. It is specifically, though, some of the work you can do in supporting someone is talk about their life, the memories, the joy, and the struggles, really looking at them as a whole person, but not necessarily, we don't have to talk about their death, that one moment. A couple more things from this young person. She shared, be willing to provide support in silence. We'll talk about this in a moment also, but the idea here is, of course, be the best listener you can be. You don't have to fix their grief, and you can't fix their grief, but you can support in silence. And that might mean going on a walk or having coffee and just listening. And this last one she shares is do your own research. We'll talk about this again in a few minutes. But the idea here that this young person was sharing is sometimes the person grieving also has to be the educator. So if you can pause and say, gosh, I have a bunch of questions about suicide or about suicide grief or about what happened, maybe what I'm going to do before I offer to support is I may go read a little bit. I may go try to understand a bit so that my support is all about support and not about a learning opportunity, because the person grieving, we put them in a challenging place where they also have to be an educator or change or or provide information that it can be really hard for them. And then they don't feel as supported as they could be. So one of the key skills here is empathetic listening. So this is listening patiently without judgment. So helping anyone who has a loss to suicide, and really, truly, this is a skill that we can use across the board professionally and individually in relationships, in schools, in churches. This skill is a really critical skill. There is research that shares that in studying and working with people who've been in crisis, which grief to suicide could be a crisis moment. They remember that big dysregulation, is that when you ask them what is something they may need, right? A majority of people say, I just need a really good listener. So learning this skill is critically important. So I want to reflect on this skill for a couple moments here. So when we talk about supporting people, we sometimes use the word sympathy, right? And empathy. And Brené Brown talks about this a lot if you follow her podcast and so on. I just want to spend a moment here. These two, they really are different words. And what I mean by that is sympathy comes from our ego, right? It's that feeling of what should I do, right? We're not necessarily always thinking about the other person. I should bring a casserole, I should bring flowers. And that's a kind thing. So don't get me wrong. Sympathy is a good thing to do. Empathy is a deeper thing to do, right? It's a deeper piece to come from the heart. It's actually trying to feel others' pains, to share their experience. And we'll talk about how you can, as you can learn and grow to support someone who's had a loss of suicide, even if you haven't had a loss, how that could potentially work. So everyone wants to be accepted and understood, and empathy really builds relationships, connects, and helps. So the idea here is in that, and if anyone, again, another individual I follow and read a lot is Dr. Adam Grant, and he talks about here in hard times, people don't want to be told to look on the bright side. They want to know you're on their side. Even if you can't help them better, you can always help them feel seen. The best way to support others is not necessarily to cheer them up, it's to show up. And I think this is critically important. Sometimes we're really focused on how we make it better, but many people who are grieving, they actually don't necessarily want it to be better immediately. They want to feel the feelings of losing someone. And work on getting better, right? Because it's not about, again, moving on. It's about moving forward and integrating their loss. And that's a process. So just some ideas here. And again, this is at a high level, listening without judgment, right? We're going to talk about judgment in just a minute. Listening with intention, making an intentional choice to go. I'm going to be a listener today. Listening without advice, just gathering, hearing, helping the person feel seen and heard. Listen to try to understand. You may never really understand their loss, but you can try to lean into it a bit. Listen with vulnerability. It means you may have to kind of open some places in yourself and some emotions that you don't typically open. This language here, I just really love. Listen with your heart, not your words, right? You don't have to have words and you don't have to respond to everything they say. And listen, not to fix it, but to care. So when you're expressing empathy, you're trying to connect with the person. You're offering validating statements that let the person know it's okay to have these emotions. And there's a lot of different phrases you can use. And really, I just use some examples here, but try to, if you're really supporting someone, think of some validating statements because they may share some really challenging emotions. Maybe someone shares anger and that's confusing to you. I don't understand why you'd be angry. Instead of saying, I don't understand, say, I hear you. You have every right to feel that way. Can you tell me more? That's a whole different empathetic response. It's natural to feel that way. Tell me more. When you say you're confused, what do you mean? It must be really hard to carry this much sorrow, right? So these are just different ways, some ideas, but again, more empathetic listening than sympathetic. And so again, leaning in Brené Brown, the truth is rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. So again, it's not what you say, it's what you do. Being present, being a good listener, making something, what makes something better is connecting with them. Okay. So some key considerations, especially for as you make a choice to lean into someone who may be grieving from suicide, and we're also going to be getting to a place where we'll be talking more about supporting yourself if you are currently the griever. So there's things to avoid, right? So you do not imply or place blame. These are some of these judgment things that we'll be talking about a little deeper in just a minute. Do not ask about means, right? If you are actually offering empathy, which is living with them and their emotions, the means actually don't matter. They are gone, right? So you may have your own questions, but it's not the place when you are offering empathy to ask. It's something you want to avoid. Avoid hurtful language. Make sure you know the language of suicide loss. I'll share a couple of information about that in just a second. And don't be afraid. Remember that question rose up earlier. Don't be afraid to name the person, and don't wait for them to reach out. Right? Sometimes we don't reach out, and we understand we get busy. Right. And know that one of the responses to a suicide loss is a feeling of loneliness and isolation, because it's such a shock to your system that you feel no one else has ever gone through this. So it may be really thinking about explicit moments and really moments that you want to reach out and saying, even if it's okay to give it 2 weeks, but really finding that time to be a support system. So some of the things that talking about judgment, I really want to reflect on as you enter the conversations, consider some considerations, right? Consider how you talk about suicide. So some phrases actually can perpetuate stigma and hinder efforts around suicide prevention and actually overwhelm people who have had a loss of suicide and are grieving. So the language, like an example of committed suicide, we know so much more about suicide and mental illness that we know it's not a criminal act. We know there's a mental health struggle. So let's remove that. We can talk about died by suicide. I've had a loss to suicide, and just kind of grasp that and kind of integrate that into your language as you're supporting someone. And sometimes we do have, of course, we might have our own judgments. And you may be questioning, all kinds of things that may have happened in the person who died story or in the family story. But if you're going to offer empathy, if you are choosing to be the support system, try compassion and curiosity. We need to support those who are grieving by viewing them, they're in an emotional crisis and they need support. And with care and compassion, they can move into that restoration and recovery time. It's not that we don't want to talk about some of these things, it's just finding the right time. If they're in an emotional crisis, then compassion and curiosity are the interest place. So it can consider again. Sometimes we think it's a personal choice, selfish. We know that those things are not true. The research will show that the understanding of this is different. We know so much more, again, here it says it about the brain mental health struggles. We know emotional difficulties are not personal shortcomings or a sign of weakness. Suicide is a mental health crisis. So I want to talk about the complexity of suicide for just a moment, because I want to help you if you're entering a conversation to support someone, or if you are grieving, to really say, gosh, this is a complex thing that's happening around me, and I want to understand it, because that understanding will then allow me to be maybe more empathetic. So we often underestimate how many factors actually come into a complex and something that's complex as final suicide. There's emotional pain. Suicide is often described by those that have attempted and so on as a point at which pain exceeds the ability to cope. That's something many of us don't understand. So in sharing that here, think about that empathy of that, how you could support someone who's grieving because that person was in that space. The person who's died, they have a lack of flexible thinking. Maybe there weren't resources available. And then, like I shared at the beginning, we each join this webinar with our own personal story. Each person that has died by suicide and each person that is grieving by suicide, from a suicide, has their own story that they're bringing to the table. So they are not selfish. They may feel that they're a burden to others or experience intense emotional pain. This may be then reflected in the person who's grieving, that they may be recognizing some of the things after the loss, and those are support systems. So sharing some of this, again, is about building your empathy. People who die by suicide are unable to make rational, life-affirming decisions. They feel hopeless. There's a negative view. So again, the person who's grieving that you may be supporting may have some of these feelings, and you want to provide empathy and support to help them through, to integrate and digest those feelings and kind of really live those feelings so they can move forward. So other considerations, you may want to consider support in a developmentally appropriate way also. So thinking about the household. As an example, a 2-year-old, right? So may censor something different. They may replicate feelings. They may show sadness, but maybe they're not feeling sadness. Maybe they don't understand it. And if many of your parents probably is that, if you cry, your child cries, especially at this age, right? So they may not even remember the person who died. So there's lots of ways to support someone at that age. For children on the age of 8, you really only need to answer the questions that are asked. Sometimes we want to divulge too much, and that can overwhelm. So as an example, if they ask, what happened to Uncle Joe? Well, he died. Is he not around anymore? No, he's not going to be coming anymore, right? It's not getting into, as they get older, you might want to talk more about mental health struggles and suicide, but we don't need to put all that on the table for an 8-year-old. So consider support in a developmentally appropriate way also is talking about when we get to be an adolescent, thinking about if you're supporting a young person, begin around the age of 13, they may want to process that life is fragile. They may look at death as inevitable, right? They see those things that we have if we're all the adults here, we've grown to understand this in a different way. They're still learning it. So they may worry about their own death. They may not want to talk about it. They may sometimes hide their feelings, but that doesn't mean they don't want to process their feelings. They may be angry at the person. And what we find across the board for anyone's at a loss is peer support can be really helpful, connecting with others who've had a loss to suicide, other peers. And so that's a really important thing. And finding that can be very challenging, right? So I have a couple of resources I want to share right now. And Megan, who's helping with the organization of all this, is maybe going to put these in the chat, is there's an organization called the Kida Center, which is also within the Kida Center. It has a summer camp that's up in Maine for young people who've had a loss to suicide. So the Kida Center is there to support those who have a loss to suicide. And then Camp Kida is a resource for those who've had a loss to suicide. So it's for young people. It's a week-long summer camp. It's free. It's up in Maine. And it's this resource that allows these peers to connect. In addition to that, for teens, I recently we recently released a documentary through an organization called Rethink the Conversation, and the documentary is called Talking Out Loud, a Conversation, and it's with teens. It's teens talking to other teens about their experience and their loss to suicide. And the point or the goal of the film is for the teens to talk to each other, but also to show the film to other teens who may have had a loss of suicide so they don't feel as alone. So there's just a couple of resources there that I know we'll be sending as a document, and I'm sure Megan has put in the chat. So you also may want to consider support in reflection of identity. And what I mean by identity is the connection to the loss. If you're supporting a family, a mother is going to be grieving in a different way. A mother might be grieving in a different way of losing a child than the sibling might, right? Or a spouse or a friend, right? So really thinking about what their specific needs are by asking them. And I'll talk about how you do that. The identity exploration might also be connected to gender and sexuality and race, really thinking about what the needs are based on identity for the individual who's in front of you, understanding the dynamics of who they are. Because part of this journey of grief, and it could be exploring a new piece of their identity. What I mean by that is for a spouse thinking about being a widow or a widower, right? That's a new piece of the identity. As sibling, if there are two children in the family and now there's one, what does that mean for them? That's a new piece of their identity. And that's part of their grief process that can be very challenging. So where do you step in and know how can you support that? That's some things we want to think about because that part of that process, part of the healing process is an exploration of identity. So also consider support in reflection of culture. So understand that there's no correct way to grieve, and it looks different in different cultures and different religions and different spiritual practices. So understanding that if you are providing empathy, it's not the moment to kind of instill the way that you believe or the way that you do things. It's really trying to understand the way that they do, right? So that might even mean if the family or the individual you're trying to support, you know that point earlier that the young person shared about do your own research. This might be one of those moments where you really want to reflect on that. So just consider some considerations. And I want to pause, and I say a pause just for everyone to maybe take a breath, right? I'm going to do that myself, maybe sip on my tea, because I think it's really important that we do that in this talk. And I do think the other piece of this that I want to share as you're taking that breath or stretching or whatever is really, as you're supporting someone who's grieving, honor the needs and the wants of the grieving. Honor their needs and wants because it's their story to tell. It can be very upsetting and very challenging when we assume or we tell the story or because we may not have the story correct. And that can be very upset to the grieving process. So in honoring the needs and wants of the grieving, I wonder right now, Megan's going to put up another poll. And maybe if you just like to pause and take a breath and maybe share who you've lost and maybe make at least some visual connection to there's others on this call who also lost someone connected this way. So thank you for taking that time on that poll. Just want to make sure everyone has a moment to do that. I'm just checking the numbers. I'm going to let that poll go for a second. And as you finish it, I hope you can reflect on that. I want to talk about memorialization. And this is as you're supporting someone, but also there's a piece here about supporting community. As you're supporting someone or you're thinking about how I care and honor my person as well as honor myself. So thank you all for sharing who you may have lost in your community and for yourself and your connections. And thank you all for being here and being a part of this conversation. Thank you, Megan, for that. So really, families and individuals, it's up for them to choose how they want to memorialize, right? So I do think sometimes it's really critically important to maybe reflect with your therapist or your mental health professional about how you want to do this, because once you put your story out, your story is out, right? So if you are planting a tree as an example, and you put a a placard, I can't think of the right word, a placard down there, and it says the person's name and maybe a loss of suicide. Now that person that you lost and your story is out there. That may be something you want to do. You want to lessen stigma, you want to do that. But understand that it may be a process for you to get there. So how do you do this? It's also important that if you are supporting someone, this is a question that came up in registration, if you are supporting a family, you may want to ask them about things like, if you're choosing to participate in a community walk, and as an example, you may want to wear a shirt, or you might want to do the walk in their son's name, let's say. You may want to ask if that is okay to do. Some families want to keep this type of loss very private. Some don't. Some are in between. So it's really up for the family and the parents and the individuals who are connected to the loss to make these decisions. It doesn't mean you can't engage. It doesn't mean they may not want to hear the name, or they may not want some of these things. It's just understanding how you can support. Another pause here is thinking about community memorialization, especially if the loss is a young person. Now, the word reach out is there as a reminder to me to share that no school, no church, no community is alone in this, right? So if you had a loss like this, know that there's tools. You can see at the bottom here that this is one of the resources we will share with you for schools, but there are tools, there are resources, there are organizations that do this work, that support people and support communities. It's for many communities and schools and churches, you may want to be proactive about having this policy documented, right? Develop a policy on how you are honoring the grief, how you're recognizing the loss, and strive to treat all deaths the same way. Different approaches, a loss of suicide, a loss to in a different way, can reinforce prejudice. And this last piece is critical. And again, if you're a school, know that there's organizations and tools. One of those that I will share is Joanne Harpel, who leads an organization called Coping After Suicide. She is a leader in this work, and so she's someone to reach out to. She actually contributed to some of the writing of this toolkit. And it's also the organization that I lead peer groups through. So I know Megan will probably put that information in the chat also about that person as a contact, as well as a resource for peer groups. So students, of course, will want to memorialize a peer. We want to balance this off, though, because we don't want to glamorize, we don't want to romanticize a loss like this, because there is something called suicide contagion. If other young people at risk, they see this loss, and if we unintentionally make a large production, we glamorize it, not intentionally, but we make something different, then that can actually send a message that is something we don't want to be sending, that this is a way for others to recognize you. We want you to get support. So we really want to be talking to the community around support systems and structures and things like that. So again, this is a much deeper topic that I don't want to fly right through, but I want to make sure you know that there's lots of tools and resources. And if you're with a school, if you're with a community organization, if you're with a church or anything else like that, reach out, because we can help to share resources and be proactive so that you're not scrambling if something tragic like this does happen for your community. So let's get deep to kind of the nitty-gritty here. And what I mean by that, we've kind of stated a level of that I hope feels really supportive and helpful. But at the same time, I want to give you some things to you can actually walk away and try. So at this point, I want to talk about how we support others and how we support ourselves. And so I'm going to ask Megan to put up another poll that we thought of, which is really, what are you doing right now to care for yourself? This is a really important reflection. It's okay, and maybe self-care, walking, things like that. What are you currently doing? This is a really healthy reflection to do. So tied to your loss on a daily basis, tied to supporting others, what are you doing? Well, that's a great thing, yeah. So it's a great reflection to do every once in a while. As you're completing that poll, and I know Megan will finish that up, I will move to the next part. I want to make sure I get in for questions. So a start in support, just a start. When I say a start, this is the entry point. So if you are saying, gosh, I really want to reach out to that family or that individual and they just had a loss, A start might be 2 questions and an offer. How are you? What do you need? Can I listen? Right? So how are you might be, how are you? They say, I'm not sure. I'm just numb. Well, what do you think you need? I'm not sure. Well, can I listen? Of course, that's what I need. That's it. It might be bigger than that. How are you? I'm overwhelmed. I can't do the laundry. I can't get to the kids are everywhere. I lost my husband. I'm just really overwhelmed. What do you need? Gosh, if I could get a meal or two done this week, great. I'm going to set that up for you. And can I sit and listen? Let's make some tea together, right? So 2 questions, 1 offer, great place to start, especially if you're like, I feel overwhelmed. I don't know what to do and how to help. There we go. So this quote always is really important to me because I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that the human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed. And people that are grieving actually want to be witnessed in their grief. They want to be heard. They want to talk about their big feelings. But they won't do it with anyone in general, right? They will do it with people they feel safe, that they trust, who are good listeners, empathetic listeners, who aren't offering advice and overwhelming them, right? So really think about how you want to help your person be seen or heard. So if you've shown up today and you're like, gosh, this is all good information, I want to know some ideas of how to help myself. So a start if you are grieving. So take care of yourself physically. Eat well, avoid problematic coping mechanisms. And I'm going to use an example of chocolate cake, right? It's not really a problematic coping mechanism, right? If you're going to say, I just really need a piece of cake because it's going to make me feel better, it's that comfort food thing. But it's problematic if you're eating a whole cake or eating it every night for dinner, right? So you want to find things that are healthy or balanced and just extrapolate out other things that may be more harmful to your healing. So get back into a routine. None of this is easy. Don't get me wrong. This is hard. But what I mean by getting back into your routine is systems and structures can really help. And sometimes that means a system and structure around your grief. Some people who join my peer groups will say that they really love that it's scheduled once a week for 10 weeks because they know on Tuesdays at 7, they're going to come do the work. It's in their schedule. Or you have your therapeutic sessions, your clinical work on Thursdays or whatever that is. And also try to give yourself some normalcy and even a sense of hope. Work on your emotions, feel them, don't negate or lessen them. Not easy to do, deeper work to be done there, and get support if you feel dysregulated or you're getting stuck in your grief. And again, connect. We know you don't have to share everything. You don't have to share anything, but sitting with someone, especially peers who've had a loss, can be so affirming and supportive. So a couple other things, like 2 quick skills that maybe you can take, right, and try. So if you are grieving or you are supporting someone who's grieving, this is a skill I call zooming out. And it comes from a book by Priya Parker. And it's the book is called The Art of Gathering, if it's a book you want to read. But the idea here that I've kind of taken and applied to grief is sometimes we're so zoomed in that all I'm doing is grieving. Remember we talked about the restorative process? Zooming out a bit, zooming out on grief, that then we can say, okay, I have this full life and it helps me move forward. It's important that the zooming in can happen during peer group work, during my therapy session, but I need to zoom out sometimes. So what that might look like is, for example, saying, I feel sad or I feel mad. Zooming out might be, I feel so sad and I want to study today so I can get a good grade on the test so I graduate. That's actually a sentence I heard from a teen at one point about how they were getting themselves and helping themselves. Or I feel so mad and I need to take a long walk. So zooming out a bit. So I'm a student and I want to get to medical school, or I'm a student, I want to graduate. So yes, I feel so sad and this, or, I'm running a business, or I'm a teacher and I still need to get to that 1 p.m. meeting. So zooming out a bit can be a helpful step. Going back to Susan David, making sure that you're beginning to learn that you are not your feelings. So you understand, as you saw in the last one, I said, I am feeling, or I feel, not I am sad or I am mad, right? Your feelings are a piece of data. They're giving you information. They're not your identity. So I love the sentence there at the end. Your emotion is a cloud and you are the sky. So your emotion is moving through, but you're the sky, right? So you want to give that space between you and your emotion, which again, none of this is easy. This is hard. That's why support is necessary. One other thing that you can try to do, and the teens I support use this a lot, is sometimes adding and to our feelings can allow us to move forward. So I call it the power of and, right? So I am feeling so sad and I can feed my cat. And that's not a big thing, but it's something. And when you've been mired in grief for a long time, and all of a sudden you realize that, oh, I can feed my cat, then the next thing is I can change the litter box and I can clean my room and I can go to school. It can grow, right? I'm feeling so mad and I can go to school. I'm feeling so numb and I can go to a walk, right? It adds that extra element. So trying to do this. And again, none of this is easy. It's just some skills that maybe you can take with you. So really thinking about if you're grieving or you're supporting someone with grieving is make sure you give yourself grace, right? And know that you loved your person. And this poem is one that I just really love and I use a lot. Be softer with you. You are a breathing thing, a memory to someone, a home to a life. So be softer with you. It can be really, if you are the griever, you can be judgmental of the grief process. You can say, why am I so tired all the time? Understand that it's part of your process. So be softer with you. And no matter if you are grieving or supporting someone who's grieving, make sure you're filling your own cup, right? All these pieces that you may want to take and try to fill. Are you doing time to reflect on your loss? And that may be journaling. Are you doing the nourishment pieces you need, not just food, but connection, right? It's okay to have alone time and listen to music or whatever you need. And always remember to be kind and true to yourself. Now, we still have time, but I want to make sure I'm going to go through these last pieces because maybe I want to get to a question or two. And so I want to talk about resource supports. So I know some supports have popped up that Megan has said, but I want to just talk about a couple here. One is this Hey Sam. I talked about this earlier. It's a peer-to-peer text line for young people. So if you have a young person in your life who's working on some emotions or even grieving in some way, this might be a great text line where they can talk to peers. That peer-to-peer support is so critical. Samaritans is a resource, and I'm sure Megan can put the website link and maybe the phone number out there for you. And then I just mentioned 988. And I want to specifically mention it because there's a reason why it was created. It's very distinct from 911, emergency services. This is a lifeline. It's a crisis lifeline, but it's also emotional support. So if you have questions, gosh, I want to help my friend, I'm not sure how, or my child's really struggling, I'm not sure how to start the conversation. Sometimes 988 has a caring counselor who can maybe help you guide you through some of these conversations. So my apologies. Final thoughts. Providing space for yourself and or the grieving person to be seen and heard is critical. Active, non-judgmental, empathetic listening is effective and necessary, and research will show that that is true. And today, take care of yourself. Today, by engaging in relaxing or enjoyable activity, and I'm going to give you an example of one you can do, because your system doesn't always understand if you've exerted yourself physically or emotionally and psychologically. And what I mean by that is if you just ran a 5K this last hour, you wouldn't do it in an hour, but if you just ran for the whole last hour, you'd be like, I'm tired. Maybe I need to sit down and get some water. So if you are feeling a little exhausted right now, your brain just worked really hard. Your emotions worked really hard. It's okay to say, I need to sit and relax, or I need to go on a walk and drink some water. I need to take care of myself. Don't judge what your system is telling. So one way to do this, one actual activity, is what I call moments of compassion. So sometimes we get stuck in sadness and all the emotions that are really challenging. And we have to be really explicit about finding joy, belonging, compassion, and our gratitude. So over the next 24 hours, just think of two different things. One is consider a compassionate action you may do for yourself in the next 24 hours. And then consider a compassionate action you may do in the next 20 hours for someone else. So for me, after doing a webinar like this, I may take myself on a nice long walk, and maybe I'm going to invite someone over for dinner. So doing something for me and doing something for someone else. So I want to pause right there. And I know I didn't leave as much time as I'd like for questions, but I want to go to the Q&A and see if there's any questions that we can maybe reflect on a bit. Yeah, there are lots of great questions. So I hope in the resource, I'm just glancing real quick. I hope on the resource pieces, if you're asking about resources, I hope we can get you some of those through the resource pages. And I have, and please do follow up with us if you're not finding those. Yeah, so I think I'm kind of trying to get a theme to some of these. So I think really in trying to answer the questions around grief and kind of the pieces that are happening for people is that understanding that and this is at a high level, I know it's not specific to your answers, but I really think, remember that it's a process, it's a journey. Remember that listening can help. Remembering that sometimes, again, that what the person is struggling with, it may be things like I'm rethinking life in a way. And especially with young people, a lot of times my teens will say, gosh, I don't know if I want to go to college anymore. It's not that they don't have hopes and dreams. It's just they rethought it. I've had teenagers who all of a sudden start playing the guitar and they never picked it up. They never picked it up before. And that's a really positive thing, right? Learning how to play the guitar, but things have changed, and understanding that change is confusing. And so it is true when you have big emotions that your thinking part of your brain is not going to work as hard, and you're not going to be able to access it. So giving yourself space, giving yourself time, and giving them that also. It may look like breaks. And what I mean by that is giving you explicit time to, let's take a walk. Let's put that into your schedule. And again, I also think that what you'll find, and this doesn't answer all these questions, and these are really great questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time for them, but peer group support. And I only emphasize that because talking to others who've had a loss to suicide is a whole different thing than talking about your grief to someone who doesn't understand suicide. You remember all those intricacies that I talked about, or the complexity of all the pieces that come with a suicide loss, about why the grief is different? The grief is different, so the conversations are different, so the feelings are different, so the people you're connecting with to talk about it should be different. They should be people that understand your loss. It's not that the other people can't be caring and supportive. Remember, we just talked about some skills, but it's connecting with people. As one more thought, as at the summer camp that I lead up in Maine, it was 60, 80 kids last summer. There's a beauty to them all coming together and knowing everyone in that space had a loss to suicide. Their walls came down. They were comfortable talking about it at any time. They knew anywhere they turned, they could find that support. Now, that's a unique situation, but if we can create that for others, whether it's retreats or peer groups or other things, it's just a lovely opportunity. Okay, so pausing here, I do apologize for not getting to all these questions more specifically. I'm going to ask Megan if she can maybe save the questions, because maybe there's a reflection opportunity through a blog or something that I could do that's more specific to these, if that's possible. Megan, I thank you very much. I'm asking something I'm not sure is possible. But then I want to pass it over to Casey for a closing.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for this. I think the one thing that is not going unnoticed is certainly the community that's been found in the chat, and folks sharing so much of themselves today. And we cannot thank you enough for doing that. Certainly, Megan, will save those questions that everybody is asking. I think, again, we've realized just with the response to this webinar, how much the need to talk about this more is and exists. I want to, of course, highlight again Samaritan's Grief Support Services. I know Megan put a lot of links in the chat that we are here for you. I also want to highlight our annual memorial that's happening on January 22nd, Sunday, January 22nd. So if folks are here in near Boston, that's going to be a live event. We also do have the ability to stream in. So please do look out for that. We're going to be holding some additional events focused on healing from suicide loss. So if you want to hear more, or you're interested in coming to another event like this, please sign up for our email list. There'll also be a survey that we'll ask you to fill out to give us some feedback about this. And in that survey, you will also have an opportunity to check off that you want to get emails from us from Samaritans. And again, it's 1 o'clock, and we just thank you all so much for being here today, for sharing bits of yourself, for having this really important conversation with us, and hopefully continuing to be a part of this community. Thank you.